Welcome to the Speaker's Corner Show. My name is Heiko Khoo. It's VE Day, the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. And there are a lot of events taking place today, and so I thought I would make a special show in order to discuss what happened, what the significance of VE Day is, in the context of the present circumstances, the pandemic around the world, more than 30,000 dead in Britain. That's the official dead, and unofficial dead, including care homes and so on. It's been estimated in the Financial Times this week. There was a 42,000 figure given, now probably about 50,000. So, no, I'm not saying it won't be less than that. It could be 30,000, 40,000. Well, no matter what it is, we're second highest in the world, and the government is trying to pretend that which country is highest is not relevant, and that you have to look at it from a long-term perspective now. Why? Because we've had so many dead. And we've had so many dead because the government hasn't provided masks to people, has misinformed people, has deliberately misled people, and had an attitude initially that they were Superman, they were going to conquer the world and the virus won't matter. So that's the sort of background. So what is VE Day? VE Day is the celebration of victory in Europe. Now, I remember being here in 1995 when the 50th anniversary of the victory in Europe was celebrated, and there were 500,000 people here. And when I came and spoke over in the corner over there where Lord Soper was speaking as well at that time, I got up and spoke, and I made a very impassioned speech explaining the origins and characteristics of warfare under capitalism. And I say under capitalism, but there was a phrase used by Bertolt Brecht when he described the fascists, and he said, you've killed the fascist monster, but not the mother that gave birth to it. So the mother, for Bertolt Brecht, of warfare and fascism is the system of capitalism itself. Now, what is the system of capitalism? According to Karl Marx, and I'm a big fan of Karl Marx, as anybody who is familiar with me will know, capitalism is a system in which the production of wealth to satisfy the wants and needs of the people is produced for profit. And profit drives the system. The maximization of profit drives the system, drives the capitalist to invest blindly. They compete one against another, and therefore we don't know whether what we produce will be sold. And on the other side, where does the profit come from? Where does the rent, the interest, and the profits come from? They come from the unpaid labor power of the mass of working people around the world. And so once you understand the fundamental structure of property relations and how that reproduces the social relations in society, in other words, the poor and the rich, the worker and the owner, the landlord and the tenant, the banker and the person who deposits their money on the one side, on the other side, the person who can be enslaved by them. For example, a mortgage agreement might compel someone economically to work for 30 years beyond their capacity to buy their house so that they have somewhere to live. Now, capitalism produces war. How does it produce war? Well, just like capitalism produced this crisis, the virus crisis. Now, I know you're going to say, some people will say, well, China produced it, or zoonotic transfer produced it, or it's a disease that's got nothing to do with capitalism. That's not true. Had there been masks available to the population, in particular to the health service workers and care home workers, from day one to protect them from the transmission of this virus, the numbers of dead in Britain would be in the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 maybe. Even that would be too high, but 3,000 rather than 30 or 50,000, depending on whose figures you're checking. Now, so it does matter what type of social system you have, because it shapes the way in which society reacts to particular events. So take, for example, the whole discussion now about China. Donald Trump, but not only Donald Trump, Michael Gove has been blaming China for the crisis around the world. And yet China was the victim of the virus. And no, it wasn't made in a lab, and if you want me to provide evidence for that, you can email me, admin@speakerscorner.net, and I will send you enough information about what has happened to convince you that there was no lab production of the virus. But how does capitalism generate war then? Well, Adolf Hitler was a product of circumstances. He appeared as the representative of a destroyed petty bourgeoisie. What is a petty bourgeoisie? It means an intermediate strata, not living by labor power in organized large-scale workplaces, not owning capital, but struggling in between, vacillating between the interests of big business and the interests of the workers. Now, what does that mean, vacillating between? It means during a period of strong economic growth, the middle classes and their children are consolidated within the social system. So in other words, if your children go to university and study, and then they come out of university and they get a job within the system, a designer, an engineer, a scientist, an artist, a theatre performer, all of these positions, if they enter the system and they gradually improve their conditions as they go along in life, then the middle class are part, if you like, of a buffer surrounding the small layer of people, the 0.01% who actually own most of the resources in the world, or the key resources in the world. Around them is a buffer created, a layer of people who reproduce the values, social relations, economic structures, and power relations in society that enable the tiny leading elite to control through a much wider pyramid of power over the mass at the bottom. Now, of course, this is not only an internal phenomenon within the advanced capitalist countries, but it's a global phenomenon. And so what you also have is that the wealthiest capitalist countries, France, Britain, Germany, the United States, Japan, the initiators of capitalism around the world, managed to produce, because capitalism is a very dynamic system of commodity production for profit, they managed to produce over and above what was required within the nation state. And so they began to export around the world as well and gain control over vast swathes of the world to take resources from those countries. Generally, the pattern in the past, up until the Second World War, was that we manufacture goods in the advanced capitalist countries, and that the raw materials for that manufactured process come from the colonies, the subject peoples of the world. And don't forget, until 1947, Britain had the biggest empire in world history. And the people of India, of Africa, of South America, and of East Asia, including large parts of China, were occupied and controlled by imperial power, and much of that dominance around the world was organized in this city here, London. Now, today in the celebrations, they're going to be commemorating VE Day. And in 1995, I remember standing here, and there was a man came up to us. His name was Heiko Khoo. He was a tiny little rake of a person. And he shouted out at me, "Have you ever served in Her Majesty's army?" I said to him, "No, sir, I have not. Have you?" And there must have been about 100 people in the audience. It was a very big meeting. And he says, yes, I served parachute regiment. So he was in the SAS. And then afterwards, he came up to the front of the meeting, he tore off his shirt, and he showed us these slash wounds, like someone had ridden a knife along his back and his front. And these slash wounds, because he got captured in Iraq in the Gulf War of 1991. And when he was captured, he was tortured by the Iraqis. And he told us that every time he hears even a car backfire, he jumps in the corner. He suffered from severe PTSD. And he lived in a Salvation Army hostel, and he was getting £130 a month to live on, other than his rent. And he told us that the British Army had actually, his section of the British Army, the paratrooper, had invaded Iraq behind enemy lines before the official attack, or the official war was declared. In any case, the point being that an army is a mirror of society. And when a society, a nation, goes to war with another nation, it is going to war as that mirror. The pretense is that we're all united together in the nation. King, country, people, business, workers, all together. And there's a lot of that now. You know, you see these adverts for social distancing by Sainsbury's. No, it'll be like, you know, help the poor by Travelodge, and all these insane ways in which the corporate sector is trying to present itself as serving the national interest, whereas in reality the corporate sector is getting bailed out by the masses, by you, your children, and your children's children. We are bailing out the corporate sector. We will be bailing out the corporate sector for the money they've received now during the corona crisis. Now, so what the First World War produced the Second World War? Well, Adolf Hitler emerged because at the end of the First World War, the British, the French, and others demanded unpayable reparations from Germany, which led to hyperinflation, and which then destroyed the middle class. And because the middle class vacillate between capital and labour, the middle class was swinging towards the communists and towards the Nazis. And then in 1933, Adolf Hitler was placed in power by an enabling act because the Reichstag had been burnt down. And then the fascists went on the march, not only in Germany, but in many countries, even in Britain. You know, don't forget the King of England in 1938 was a Nazi, and during the Second World War, Edward and Mrs. Simpson, isn't it? King Edward. Well, King Edward, then he was in Bermuda, I believe it was, as the Governor General there, I think. And Adolf Hitler had this plan, you know, that when they invade Britain, they'll put Edward back in power. And so Hitler met with Edward several times and with Mrs. Simpson and discussed. And there are pictures, you know, it's not really fair in a way, but there are pictures of Elizabeth II doing Nazi salutes as a little child, and that's how deeply it was ingrained in the family, that they had this affinity with the Nazi cause, destroy the communists, smash the Soviet Union. That was the idea. And what they don't do in Britain is they don't tell you, or they barely tell you. You know, you have to do a bit of research, you know, because they like to have sort of common viewpoints, common identities around the concept of what the nation is, what it stands for, and what its grand historical moments are. And one of the grand historical moments is supposed to be the Second World War, you know, Britain defeating the Nazis in the Second World War. The problem with the argument is it isn't true. In fact, it was the Soviet Union which defeated the Nazis. More than 60% of the German army faced the Soviet Union. And the real battles of the Second World War in the European or the Western field of conflict were Kursk and Stalingrad. These two titanic battles were fought by the masses of Russia, not because they loved Stalin, but because they believed in fighting for their country, their cause, and they actually, well, at least technically, they owned the country. Whatever was in the Soviet Union was built by the masses under pressure from Stalin and so on, the bureaucracy which ruled over Russia and the Soviet Union, but ultimately it was the masses who built it up. And so that was what they were defending, their land, their country, their production, their energy, their people. And they smashed the Nazis. And they smashed the Nazis precisely because they had that internal unity of the masses. It's one of the reasons why the Chinese have been able to defeat the virus so well, is because there was a mass mobilization by the people, not by the government, by the people of China to fight the virus, particularly in Wuhan and Hubei. You know, there are lots of pictures of the people at the entrance to buildings and so on with blue uniforms and so on. I think I mentioned it in the last show. These are just like caretakers, you know, they're like local residents association organizations. They are the people who defended the interests of the people in Wuhan during the lockdown, which destroyed or eliminated the virus pretty much from China. And here we are battling with 50,000 dead. Anyway, back to the theme. The Second World War was won by the Soviet Union. You won't see much talk about that today. You'll talk about the Blitz spirit and the "We will meet again." I mean, I love the song "We Will Meet Again." You know, it evokes that, yeah, some element of the personality of the British, and it's a very sweet and beautiful song. But don't forget, there's nearly 50,000 people, 30 to 50,000 people will not be meeting again. Think of all their families and their friends and associates. Dead because of what? Dead because of government policy. And beyond the government policy, the pressures and interests that push that government policy, the pressures of the capitalist class to make the maximum profit and create a society which facilitates profit making as the primary societal objective. Now, after the Second World War ended, almost immediately afterwards, a new war was created, a new war, the Cold War. And the Cold War, you know, you'll often see the Soviet Union blamed for that. Actually, the Soviet Union made a deal with the West. And the deal was basically, we take the East, you take the West, and we won't make trouble for you in the West. So the Communist Party in Italy, in France, and in Greece, which led the anti-Nazi resistance movement, they were told, do not take power. The Communist parties were very powerful in those countries, but do not take power, because Stalin didn't believe that these countries would toe the line from Moscow, and they weren't easily controlled. And therefore, if they had communist governments, there would be some sort of new model communism. And in the meantime, they took over Eastern Europe. Well, the Soviet army had marched into Eastern Europe anyway, and in some countries like Czechoslovakia, armed the masses to take control of society. And in Germany, it was unclear. There was a game going on about the future of Germany. The country was divided, as we know, like Austria was. In Austria, they withdrew in 1955. In Germany, they remained right up until 1990, the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. That's when the four powers left. So after the four powers left, the central focus of Europe became really revolved back into the control of German imperialism. By that I mean the German capitalist class, linked in with its interests to maintain profits and power, extended after 1990 its power through the European Union, through the Euro, to create a field of operation for German capitalism. On the other side, when European capitalism was rising after the Second World War, in particular up until the year 2008, American capitalism was also in decline, and since the 2000s, China has been rising every single year, 6-7% of its economy, growth in its economy, and that's made China a major challenger in world production. So world production, Europe is number one, but it's not a unified nation state. China is the United States number 2, and China number 3. But in actual fact, in global dollar term GDP, America is number 1 and China is number 2. Now, whenever you have a fundamental rivalry over resources, power, prestige, authority, you have the foundations for warfare. And that's why it's a very dangerous time we're living in now, as the virus globally impacts society. So we are going to witness the emergence of new justifications for war, or for the preparation of war. We've already had the economic war. There was a very famous phrase, war is a continuation of policy by other means. And if you extend that a little bit, you can also conclude war is a continuation of business by other means. Because business rules the world and rules politics. Politics, according to Lenin, is concentrated economics. That's the Russian revolutionary, concentrated economics. So politics is deciding which type of economic policies will be adopted and pushed, which group of capitalists will be promoted, which will be demoted, to the degree that government can intervene to decide that. And so what we are witnessing with the conflict with China, which began initially as after 2008 was the main emergence of the new conflict with China. Before 2008, I think the attitude in the ruling circles in America and Europe was that at some stage China would suffer an internal collapse, like the Soviet Union did, like Eastern Europe did in 1989. It would be an unstable regime. Once that crash came, then of course all the world's powers would be able to intervene there. They might either divide China up into different segments, which would be influenced and controlled by other countries, or it would become some sort of semi-democratic state, maybe like India or something like that. But it would also certainly suffer a colossal collapse in living standards, which would drive millions and millions into poverty or even possibly starvation, because conflicts would break out about who owns, controls what resources in a newly privatized Chinese economy. And just as between the First and Second World War, China suffered from warlords controlling different regions of the country. It wasn't really a unified country. And then it was invaded by the Japanese. That was actually, in many ways, the beginning of the Second World War. Now, the conflict of China is a bogus justification, but it's certainly, no matter where you go, on Facebook, for example, I look around at what people post, and large numbers of people who you would think would be, in inverted commas, on the left, you think would be aware, you think they'd understand things, yet you see them repeating the same nonsense about China. China is to blame. In some way, China is to blame. Now, in these circumstances where people are seeking to blame people, well, if it was just about the virus, it would be fine. But it's not really about the virus. It wouldn't be fine, but it would be, something that would pass with an investigation of some sort, or, with people making their mind up or forgetting about the issue as it disappears. But we're not dealing with a virus. The virus is merely a component of the totality of the issues about the social system we live under. And because of that, the crisis and conflicts will get much more exacerbated. Because don't forget, this is one of the first, or perhaps the first ever, even the First World War and Second World War weren't quite global wars. There were parts of the world that were relatively immune from the conflicts. And yet this conflict, well, short duration it may be, we don't know, but it is something that has taken on a global characteristic, and it's also brought about a simultaneous global economic crash unlike anything that has ever been seen before in history. Now that might seem odd to you, because you look around you, we're sitting in a sunny day in a park, and a country that's relatively wealthy, they've pumped out money to provide people with, the means of existence. Many people may not be getting it, though. That's another issue. But in theory, of course, there's been some sort of general provision for people. And I think the general provision, I was talking to someone last night and they told me that a friend of theirs got £10,000 suddenly chucked in their account. You know, they have a property which is a sort of business property, and suddenly the council had given them £10,000. And so there is a large S, what they call helicopter money. Keynesianism is a theoretical variant of capitalism that suggests that when economic crises occur, they believe economic crises are inevitable within capitalism, much like Marx argues. And when capitalist crises occur, the way out of it is to basically drop money out of helicopters and maintain demand, both for employment and also for commodities. And then gradually the animal instinct of capitalists trying to make money will begin to revive the economy again. So you get cycles of the economy, and the government can intervene to ameliorate the characteristics of those cycles. That's the theory of Keynesianism. It's never actually worked in practice, perhaps except for in advance of the Second World War. And after the Second World War, Marshall Plan was to some degree the reconstruction program of capitalism, but it's not really Keynesianism in that sense. 1970s they basically felt that Keynesianism had run out, and then the big capitalists wanted to get a piece of the pie, by selling off all the public sector entities like those in the Soviet Union and so on. The kleptocrats grabbed that, but also by selling off the property and the institutions and operations run by the state inside the advanced capitalist countries. So, for example, the general process of private investment and private involvement in the health service in Britain, which of course is responsible for the reasons why people are dead. That's why this is happening. And in Sweden, by the way, which has carried out, as you know, a different policy in relation to the suppression of the virus. They've tried to rely upon public information campaign and social distancing carried out voluntarily, which to some degree is not a bad idea, provided you protect those who are most likely to be killed. And that's not what they did. Because just the same as here, they have had this tendency to privatise, and the consequence of that is that the old and infirm in care homes have been dropping down dead like flies in Sweden because they're not properly protected and because the care homes don't take adequate care of these people. It's all about money-making operation, And the money-making operation will not provide the surplus needed, if you like, masks, resources, manpower, skills, to protect those people. So the consequences is this strange battlefield carnage of old people who would otherwise live 2, 3, 4, 5 years longer, who are culled now in a Malthusian way by the dynamics of capitalism. But now as we come out of this present lockdown, we're being confronted by a totally new world. In that totally new world, fears, angst, turning one against another. The nation state, of course, in each country is reinforced more than in our living memories. In Europe, they've got national borders. National borders are back to control the virus, they say. But in actual fact, it's the re-emergence of the power of the nation state and the significance of the nation state, which is in direct contradiction with the dynamics of world capitalism, because everything's integrated together. And the consequence of that is that clash between the existence of the nation state and the world division of labour, the world productive system, the world consumption system. That contradiction is at the heart of capitalism. And it is that contradiction that gave rise to the Second World War and to the First World War. The Second World War had some characteristics which were unique about it, the emergence of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement, but there are plenty of neo-Nazi organizations around the world with powerful influence nowadays. For example, in India, when I went to India in 2015 to speak at a conference, someone from Speaker's Corner actually invited me to speak at a conference, me and Ishmael. And when we went to India, I was informed by friends and comrades in India about the situation there, and they have this Hindu nationalist maniacs who called the RSS, who go around beating people up and repressing them in the name of Hindu nationalism, connected in with the ruling party in India, Modi's party. And in Brazil, I spoke to someone from Brazil a few days ago, Edison, and he's a trade unionist in the oil industry, and he explained as well that there are semi-fascist gangs going around repressing organisers, the left and so on, and repressing ideas and repressing the physical capacity of people to organise. I don't think it's quite this, it's not at the scale of Nazi Germany at the moment, but when the global economy crashes, as it is at the moment, then of course all cards are off the table. It's a completely new slate. We're entering a revolutionary period of transformation in which the class relations in society will be the focal point for revolutionary change. What do we want coming out of this? Millions of unemployed? 34 million unemployed in America? 3, 4, 5 million unemployed in Britain? Do we want that? Why don't we reduce the working week? Reorganise the society based on what we prioritise as the major needs for the people. I think Anaya and Bevan once said, socialism is the language of priorities. So we need to work out what our priorities are, nationally and internationally, so that we don't experience the same suffering, slaughter and devastation, or worse, than the generations who suffered during the Second World War all around the world. Thanks very much. That was the Speaker's Corner show for this week. Tune in every Wednesday at 3:30 and every Friday at 4 o'clock on 104.4 Resonance FM. That's broadcast to the whole of London, and you've got Greater London on digital, or you can go to resonancefm.com, and there you can find all our previous shows and also all the wonderful, bizarre, peculiar and amazing shows made by fellow Resonance producers. Visit our website, speakerscorner.net.